my name is Benedict for Hertz. In this video, we are looking at the new GeForce Oberheim SEM Synth Expander module. If you don't know what SEM, the strange word, means. Now, the fact that it has Oberheim's name and branding on it is going to be a big part of their selling thing, which to some extent I'm not going to get as heavily into as many other people will. So if you're coming to me going, is Benedict going to be able to tell me if it's as good as a real SEM? I'm not going to get into that. A, because I don't have a SEM. B, I've never actually seen one to touch one. You don't encounter them very often. They're a formative part of synth history and incredibly important, but were probably very, very rare, if not vanishingly rare, in Australia. Thank you. Sorry, clients decided now's a great time to start sending me through all the stuff for next mixes. So if we go ping, that's what it's about. The big factor, as I say here, is that GeForce have actually teamed up with Tom Oberheim, and he was the guy behind, well, the Oberheim synths, what with them having his name on it. The early companies, Bob Moog of Moog Synthesizers, Moog Synthesizers, A.R. Perlman of ARP, and of course Tom of Oberheim. There were other companies. Tom Oberheim got a lot of support from guys out of Emu Systems. Emu Systems had an amazing modular that was really, really very cool, but I don't think they ever made many of them. They made their name when it came to sampling because they made the first affordable, good quality sampler with the emulators, the SP1200 drum machine, which rappers loved, and then of course the emulator series down into the Emaxes and ESIs. So tremendous level of pedigree that was happening with these guys who were doing this kind of work. So what does it sound like? Good, really good. That shows off a feature of this. Roughly in use, it might sound something like. No, that was never played on a SEM, and yes, that is incorrect. I'm not very good at playing it either, but that's sort of similar to the architecture of what was being used. What was great about the SEM was that Tom got a very good balance of the technology of the time versus usability. I don't know how successful a standalone SEM was at the time. I don't see them name dropped on records, but the SEM led to the 2-voice, which got picked up quite a bit, the 4-voice, and then the 8-voice, which was quite literally 2, 4, or 8 of these little fellas inside a bigger box to control them with a keyboard on them. Now, users of particularly the 4 and the 8-voice were heavyweight rock and prog rock bands, particularly in America. So bands like, say, Journey Records are covered in Oberheim. And I know for a fact that 8-voices were traveling around with them. And the 8-voice, because it was 8 of these modules, you couldn't just turn one knob to control all of them. You had to control each voice, which meant that if you went through module 1, set it up, when you went to module 2, you set it up, but there was no way of knowing whether they were actually the knobs in the same position, assuming the analog hardware even sounded the same as each other from one of these little modules to another. So it meant you got this really fat, warm sound, and there was something about the Oberheim filters that just sounded amazing. So, tremendous piece of work. Here's a very simple patch. We'll look at some patches. With the demo version, you only get what they call the alpha patches. So the very first sound that plays and that is an OMG moment. It really is. go. The sort of thing that would be played in a band like, I don't know, Kansas or something like that, often with a pedal board. Again, the sort of thing that you would hear on a record, let's say Rush or something like that. That's a very modern kind of sound. This sort of thing all over tons of records. Part of the design of the SEM was that it could fit in with other instruments. So in many ways, Tom was trying to make something that could be put alongside a Model D and sort of fit in with it. I don't know that they ever used them, but something like Camel. Sort of John Carpenter kind of thing. Again, I don't know whether he used these. But for the simplicity of it, the SEM was able to punch well above what you thought it was going to do. That's showing a modern feature with the aftertouch. You will notice these are drenched in effect. Really nice emulation of the Jarre Oxygene sort of sound. Why they're calling it punk, I don't know. It almost strikes me as more as a Rick Wakeman kind of thing, but no problems either way. Horribly modern. None of this is about the complexity of the sound, or the complexity of the patch. It's about the timbre. Similar to a Simmons drum. And the Oberheims were renowned for their brass sound. Oberheim. Thank you. As I said, a lot of the presets are very, very heavily covered in effects, which was done at the time, but not as much as we see here. But fair enough, they do have to sell to a current market. But the patches that are there, and that's only a small percentage of them, I think it's about 400 that come with it, do indicate that there's a pretty good range of things that you can do from it. Let's have a look at GeForce themselves. They've been around. They're actually one of the longer established developers now within the VST environment. A lot of the first names just disappeared. They didn't last very long. Don't quite know why, but their businesses all kind of imploded. Maybe there just wasn't the demand, and we're seeing a little bit of imploding, I think, at the moment, because people have realized there just isn't the demand that they thought was out there. So the smart companies have stayed small and stayed around their basics. GeForce have set what their basics are, and they have stayed there. They have managed some sense of a coup in the sense that they have worked with Tom himself of Oberheim to make some adjustments to their product to make Tom and Marcus happier, that they feel like it's doing a decent job of seeming like the original thing. Obviously, some money exchanges hands, and again, not going to get into is this as good as a real SEM. It's way more convenient than a real SEM, I can tell you that, because it works. In terms of how does it sound, well, there's so much more to that analog sound than just the little box itself. I know, because I've been in plenty of places where people have come in with a real, like a Pro 1 or something like that, the real deal, not been hot rodded or anything like that, and then proceed to use it as though it's a TB303, which would never have happened with a Pro 1. So is it the authentic sound of a Pro 1? Well, technically, but it sure doesn't sound like 1981. This working with Tom Oberheim was primarily with the OBE, which is an 8-voice. So it's their emulation of the Oberheim 8-voice, and in this case, they've extracted the individual module. Whether they've gone back to Tom or Marcus, don't know, but nonetheless, it's an interesting synth. I think, to a certain extent, put aside the naming, the brands on things, and simply go, is it a cool synth? In terms of price, we can see that it's been pricing up at pounds, so pounds to US dollars. You would have to work out, we're going to call it £50, which is pretty fair if you dig what it does. Their intro, they're saying £30 ex VAT, so you've got to possibly pay VAT and then convert, but whatever, that's all part of it. But at $30, let's say, that's a tremendous buy if it's going to be useful for you. It's definitely a characterful little fella. I'll run through my good and bad. It sounds great. It really does. It's got this huge sound. A fair amount of that huge sound, at least off the bat, does come out of the effects. The effects are really, really nice. I'd be interested to hear them extracted. So as in little standalone effects units. Maybe they wouldn't sound as grand with something else, but it'd be interesting to be able to separate that out to sort of really get a sense of, okay, what's going on there. But with the presets, there's a lot of effect on them, which really beefs up the sound, but the sound is pretty darn impressive as it is, which we will look at a little bit more later. There is a feeling with synths like this that every action you could take, every twist of a knob, is likely to deliver something cool. Partly that's because the architecture is so small, but partly that is because the more you manage to nail what really makes an analog synth great, which is different from what makes a digital synth great, the more you're able to actually do things that might otherwise sound terrible. So you can make sounds that are off pitch and all kinds of things like that, and they just sound so cool. Whereas with a well-controlled digital synth, they just won't seem as cool. Right, wrong, don't know, just interesting. And again, I think for what it's delivering, the price is pretty good. There is the issue of, and this is one of the downsides of it being monophonic. If that's going to be a problem for you, which is a killer for me, I don't like monophonic synths as a rule, then do you cobble together some kind of poly version of this in your own DAW, which I will show you later, or do you say, look, it just makes more sense to go to the polyphonic version of this? While there's a lot of stuff about original monosynths now appearing poly in software, we'll look at that later. Not same for sure, and that's been part of what apparently Tom really made sure happened or didn't happen in G-Force's emulation of his instrument. So of course the negatives, well, it has a very limited architecture. They have added extras in this which give you a lot more doability than the pure legit architecture. There's nothing to stop you from not using those features, but nonetheless it's still a limited architecture. So at $50, say, what else would you be getting in the broader market for $50? But as we will see, it probably doesn't sound quite the same because it will be a digital instrument which may have an amazing feature set, but it probably doesn't quite sound the same as this. To get some of that, which you can do with a digital instrument, there's a lot more work that has to be done. So you're really paying, in this case, for the attention into making this digital sound seem more like an analog synth. Things that you can do, but are, well, they require time and effort and can be a pain. Plus, you need the experience to do it and do it in a useful way, because simply taking a digital synth, putting it through some kind of distortion or saturation pedal and going, no, it sounds analog, kind of not the same thing. So if you're really trying to do the analog thing on your computer screen, it's well worth the $50, even though your architecture is quite limited and you've only got one voice. That's it. There is no way to fool it into being duo or anything but, unless we get into the method, which I will show you later, because mono to poly doesn't work the same. There's a reason that monosynth sounds so aggressive, and you can't just say, okay, now we'll just add another 3 voices and it'll sound the same. No, it'll actually distort like a bastard. It really will. So let's have a look at the overall design of this beastie and how it's presented. Right from the beginning, because this needed to be affordable and he needed to be able to compete with already established names, Moog and ARP, then Tom needed to come up with something that was going to stand out. In a sense, this kind of didn't stand out because there was this funny little white box, no keyboard, no anything, meaning that you needed to be already in the game to have the nous to know how to use it. So it's not like a wasp that came with like something resembling a keyboard or a stylophone. It was this little box and you needed to, but remember, it's called an expander module. So you might have your main sound on your Model D, and then you could plug this thing in and expand what you already had. So it was a way of saying, here, for a relatively small amount of money, you can buy X number of extra voices, either to play monophonically beside your existing sound, so layering, or if you were smart enough to work out how to put them into a polyphonic round robin kind of a situation, then you could actually have yourself a polyphonic instrument, which is exactly what he did with the 2, 4, and 8 voices. So very, very simple cut-down architecture. Looking at the screen, this represents a SEM pretty well, with the exception of this stuff, which is extra. We've got this little flip button. We can flip it. Now, you couldn't flip the original because there's nothing underneath it. Maybe some little rubber feet. And then we've got some extra features. There's an extra oscillator LFO and some performance type stuff we can flip back. And I flipped it and I thought, yeah, that's nice, but... And then I realized there was an extend button and we can actually extend it and see the whole synth in one blob. Possibly a little big, possibly a little overwhelming, but it's all there. And then you can flip back and what have you. Amusing, practical enough. Patches we've handled. Obviously you can load and save patches, you can go previous, next, all that kind of stuff. The init button, which you saw me use, which gets us to a nice practical starting point. There is access to a manual, which is online. I didn't spend much time because it seemed like every page was a different web page, but just going to the vibrato, there was actually a video on it. I didn't watch the video, but you know, I think they've probably done a reasonable job there of giving you a manual. I'm guessing a little bit, but at least it does exist. That's a good start. We've got a pair of oscillators. They are sort of infinite tuning. Double click to go back where you were. You can go -2, +2 in terms of octaves, but they are infinite. But thankfully, in software, it's easy to see where you're at. I can't find a way to control or be more... Oh, well, look, there you go. Double click, we can now be more specific. Aha, well, there you go. I didn't think of trying that before. So if you can't mouse to the number that you're looking for, you can type it in. You can also right-click and, if I remember correctly, Control-click, and it'll move in whole steps, which is much better than the real one because, and I've used not these, as I said, but it's other similar synths with infinite rotary, and you're like, am I in tune? Am I in tune? You're never in tune. That's before they start wandering. Initially, the oscillators and everything, you think they don't do much. We can change FQ, which is our frequency modulation. We can choose where that comes from. Envelope 1. VCO3, which is an additional feature, or LFO1, which is little shoehorned in here. Pulse width modulation is only available if you are using pulse version. You've only got a saw or a pulse. If we're using the pulse version, nothing. Pulse version, then it becomes pulse width. Again, from wherever. It does sound different from the Juno pulse width, and that's cool. It's got their own charm. And you can preset your pulse width if we're playing the pulse width thing, to almost off with square in the middle. They are very honest about it's only 10 and 90%, which means that you can't go have that sound completely disappear and then reappear, which Ultravox in particular were big fans of. Nice fundamental sound. This LFO is an extra, otherwise you've got just a dedicated vibrato. The fact that you've got the dedicated vibrato and this LFO means you've got a fair amount of play and control. VCO2 is exactly the same. You can lock them to each other, but it seems that you need to have that actually in play for it to actually do the sync thing. Envelopes are odd. They are just an attack, decay, and sustain. You go, well, where's my R? There is no R because it's set by the D. With a limited panel and a limited price, they simply say, well, look, chances are you don't rightly need it, so we'll just double the two up. And broadly speaking, it kind of works. We then get into filter. The SEM filter is incredibly famous. Most digital synths that have more than one filter type will have a SEM option. Let me tell you, most of them don't sound like a SEM at all. Just because they're a state variable built on the same broad idea doesn't mean they sound like this little puppy at all. Let's raise our sustain here. It's kind of a raucous sort of a thing. It doesn't self-oscillator. There's no sine wave in here. Doesn't mean that you can't use your filter to go pretty dark and clean. There is the other VCO to do sine waves and what have you, but it is a nice filter. It's mostly in the action. So if we assign this to envelope 2, we can have it rise above or fall below. Mostly will rise above. So that's really getting into our classic synth brass. But a lot of what you're probably used to is the later polyphonic Jupiter 8s and particularly Prophet 5 kind of brass things that you did little stabs in sort of flat funk records. The other thing with the SEM filter, which was different from the Model D, was that we could flip between low pass and high pass, rendering some kind of a notch in the middle. A perfect notch if you're 50-50, perfect high pass. And the filter's kind of dramatic. Or flip across to band pass, which ignores this. And the band pass was very popular. I think it was Edgar Froese of Tangerine Dream. There's, I think, quite several records in a row there where he's got this kind of guitar sound that he plays leads with, and I think it was a SEM band pass. So when you get the situation right, very, very cool filter. You can, of course, assign to the third oscillator, which is new, or this and that's where you get a lot of the to-be-expected sorts of sounds. This is where you bring in VCO3, which can deliver you either whatever waveform is chosen there, or noise source. The noise source can be a wee bit overwhelming in this, but such is the nature of the beast. Yeah, that's basically what it sounds like, always and forever, when run as a straight SEM. On the backside, we have these extras. You can transpose the whole thing. It's pretty self-evident. There's an arpeggiator. This is all extras now. Different modes. And you can create your own step sequences, which no doubt that's what the Jarre Oxygene preset was. So reasonably practical. Little arpeggiator. Oh, portamento. Portamento is kind of cool. You can slide, but you can actually change the rate at which the two oscillators will slide, which gives you a lot more interest in the sound. Then we've got the mixing. So we've got the mix of just the SEM on its own, which is the core synth, total master mix, and then we can add in this reverb and delay. Now they appear to be additive, not a wet dry. which is why they've then given us a total master level. Part of the reason I think they sound so cool is because they're additive, not a wet-dry. The wet-dry balance tends to be set up to stay even-steven in terms of actual technical level, which means that the more effect you add, like at 50-50, the quieter the sound's got. So you've lost oomph. And I know that frustrates me. Most of the time where I build effects units, I build them so that there isn't a straight wet-dry. You've got a dry and then a wet, which means we're adding effect. We're not balancing effects, we're adding effect. It's a different sort of a feel. If we flipify, we've got this delay. Let's just pull our reverb out of the mix here. It is in milliseconds, but you can go into sync, but you know me and sync. Shouldn't be done, especially if you are trying to sound analog. If you're trying to sound analog and then put your BPM sync on, guess what? You don't sound analog. You just sound like somebody else using Serum. But this is an interesting effect. There's obviously more going on here than we can see. There must be some kind of modulation or something happening in the background. It sounds good. There's a high-pass filter, but not a low-pass filter. Initially, I thought, that's kind of a bit odd. If I picked one, I would have picked the other. But then I realized this thing is so fat and blub that if you put a lot of, it's just going to become unruly. So lifting a little off is a very smart move. It's 100%, meaning that it's the equivalent of 50-50. As in, here's our echo now at full volume. It goes into almost self-oscillation. Close enough. It's probably good that they've not had it go off into screaming, howling, Jimi Hendrix having a bad day kind of feedback. But somehow it adds so much more. When you've got a good oscillator form, and it's a rich synth sound already, couple that with a nice delay, you get an even richer sound. Or couple it with an ordinary delay, you can reduce your sound, but if rich, you get even richer. That's what this does. They've thought very carefully about what they've added here. So they can very easily overdo the sound that you're doing. But boy, does it sound impressive. You can lock the effects, so if you change patches, you keep the effects as they are. Good, bad, and different, nice to have. If we get rid of the, and then look at the reverb, this you can get darker or brighter. And that is an interesting reverb. It feels very thick and lush, but I think it's relatively simple, maybe just a whole pile of delays or something. It never sounds like a tin can. Whatever it is, it's a nice algorithm. So again, I would be quite interested to see what these seemed like extracted and, feed them my usual stuff and go, well, how does that sound? Decays can become excessive. You can move in real time, but the reverb will not reward you for it, which is normal enough. A little sad seeing they feel so analog in the reverb, but the delay, that behaves pretty well as you would expect. So we can get this really nice, chewy, rubbery, great sort of sound. Extras now also on the back, we have this third oscillator. Putting in the third oscillator suddenly makes it a direct competitor with a Model D, with a Mini. We can choose a saw, a sine wave, which is not available on the front panel, or a square. We can choose how we modulate. I'm not going through every part of this. You can work this out for yourself. Choose where your modulation envelope comes from, envelope 1 or 2. LFO, you can move it into an LFO. So you can keep it as an audio oscillator, drop it to LFO rates, say down 0.1. Doesn't necessarily go super slow, but it and up to it just not really into audio, but in audio rate, then you can essentially do FM. What form of FM it's doing, whether it's doing real honest to goodness FM, which is literally oscillating or modulating the frequency, or whether it's actually doing PM, which is the Yamaha DX7 FM, which was never FM. Don't know. I would assume that it's going to do more of the true, which just makes nasty noises. But there's no right or wrong either way. But the fact that it's there extends your palette, your timbre base quite a lot. And you can set it to whether it re-triggers or not, and then set a fade-in time. So that would be useful for the oscillator if you don't want that oscillator there as you begin the sound. So let's say we wanted to do piano and strings. A little absurd with this, but we could use oscillators 1 and 2 to do our piano, and then our strings come in. I don't think we'd get away with it here, but that's how you would attempt to do it. Wouldn't work out well. We've got this LFO. The LFO has various shapes, so that's interesting enough. That knob actually controls the wave as well, so you can pick and choose. That can re-trigger with your notes or not. Re-triggering is, it can be done and was done in analog, but it's a bit more of a digital synth kind of thing, and again, you can have a fade in. So a good amount of control on the LFO1, because you will use LFO1 a bit, seeing you've only otherwise got the vibrato LFO. So if you want to get exciting, LFO1 is where you need to do that. Filter can track. So you can set it that it gets brighter. So it hinges from wherever you say you want it to hinge from. 63 is middle C. Or you can have it so it gets darker and therefore gets brighter. That is useful. The very first sound I played, I had done that to get the kind of results that I wanted. We then have a fair amount of things. Velocity can go to various things, and that's how you're going to make this sound even more expressive than a real SEM could. There is also aftertouch. This one took me a couple of goes to realize, but we can set aftertouch to filter, then we can move to aftertouch to amplifier, and they are two discrete settings. So where this has 47 knobs for each possible assignment, Aftertouch actually has several destinations, but we've got one knob, which is a menu diving kind of approach. A little off track with their other knob per function approach, but they obviously ran out of space. And Aftertouch is not commonly used by most people. I use it and sometimes program it, but I don't use it. So the reality is the people who are genuinely going to be using Aftertouch are probably going to live with it being the way that it is. Again, we could extend, see the whole dice of boxes, or back to the front panel. So very, very nicely featured instrument that can be run as exactly a classic SEM or as this hot-rodded version of a SEM. We can see our assignment here and still give yourself a very interesting sort of a sound. Let's compare a sequence and a sound made from scratch. This is the SEM. You can see some modulation coming from the sequencer. Sounds pretty cool. What if we swap across to Europa, which is one of the Reason synths and a very, very capable digital instrument that you can make sound great. What does it sound like now? While it's exactly the same line and as much as possible exactly the same automation, you can hear that they are in fact really two completely different results. I don't want to get into saying that the Europa can't cut it, but well, I'm sorry, the Europa really struggles. There's many things that the Europa can do that the SEM cannot. But there is just that something that comes out of all the extra time and energy, and I put a certain amount of time and energy into trying to get Europa to compete on a one-for-one, and we get away with it on stage, but it's not the same result. And that's not saying that Europa or digital synths or VSTs or whatever are bad. Simply that they don't become even Steven. So you can see here even we've got the MIDI and 1, 2, 3 lots of modulation. So we're moving VCO2 frequency, the cutoff, and the vibrato amount. To do the same thing, I had to do a lot more programming inside of Europa. You see that there was a lot more had to go into the mod matrix just to try to get it to sort of seem kind of the same. And tone-wise, no matter what I did, if I got a little closer here, I moved away from there. So it was not easy to duplicate, and it was definitely not as easy as just going, oh, I'll whack some distortion on it and I'll be good, mate. There's more happening in there, so I probably was doing more damage than good as I tried to put drive in, despite using the SEM filter form in here. I even tried other filter forms and could not nail this sound. There is so much movement and activity in there that I couldn't clone it. Now, that's kind of cool. That's, as far as I'm concerned, what you're paying for in this sort of situation. If you say, look, that's the thing that I want to get, because I want that kind of feel and I'm not getting it somewhere else. Well, firstly, up your game, because you'd be amazed what you get out of something like Europa. There was a track many, many years ago I bought myself a Slim Fatty, a little Moog Slim Fatty. I'd gotten rid of all my hardware, and it was like, oh, okay. And so I bought this thing, and I'd always, it's like you grow up and you're like, I'm going to get a real Moog someday. So I got this little thing. Came from the manufacturer, bashed. Actually, you shouldn't blame the manufacturer, as a distributor. And the thing was all bent. I was amazed. They must have known it when they put it in the box. But nonetheless, once I sort of got my head around getting this thing to run and waiting 20 minutes for it to warm up, the software integration was a nightmare. It was just 1997 sort of standard of software integration, and I was amazed because this was being sold to door people. And I started writing a piece with it, and it's like, well, this is really clunky compared to what I'm used to doing. And finished a piece, and the sound that it just started with was recorded into the sequencer. Put this piece online, with everyone going analog this, analog that, and I said to people, there's a lot of Thor in here, which is the other Reason synth, because Europa wasn't out at that time, and there is a Slim Fatty line in here. Let's see who can pick it out, because if this analog synth is significantly better than the digital instruments, then it should shine on its own. You know what? No one has ever picked it. They have picked every single Thor sound as being the Moog sound, the real analog sound, and never chose the Slim Fatty sound. To be fair, the Slim Fatty probably has one of the least striking sounds in the piece, but nonetheless, if analog has this amazing that you can't get anywhere else, surely that sound should have stood out as being head and shoulders above all the other sounds. And the Thor sounds, which were made to sound like a real Moog, people should have gone, look, good try, Benedict, but you're not there. No, they picked all the soft synths over the real analog. It's just about movement. The next thing that you're going to raise is the, oh, but it's only monophonic, what if I can make it polyphonic? So here's the polyphonic instrument. We can see distributor here is taking the notes that come in, sending one to the first SEM, the next one to the next SEM, and so on. And now it'll cut off. Oh my God, that sounds like Menergy. Menergy. And it sounds great. But it sounds neither like a monosynth nor like a polysynth, like a real analog polysynth. It sounds great. We would say, oh yes. But it actually doesn't sound like one. And in effect, it sort of sounds like a quite nicely prepared digital synth with some problems. My point here is that if you're looking to spend 50 and go, oh, well, I'll be clever and I'll use whatever doohickey I've got to make multiple voices out of it, and then I will have an 8 voice or a Jupiter 8 or whatever, you won't. Because, as they point out on the site, the way that you have to design a monosynth compared to a polysynth, or more to the point, the way you have to build the architecture of a polysynth compared to a mono, is quite different. The first time I did this approach, I was quite surprised and disappointed, and then I did some reading on what happens, and even actually spoke to the manufacturer of that particular device, and they said, yeah, it can't work, because I loved their mono, and it's like, yeah, but I don't think I'm going to buy this until you make a poly version of it. I thought they were just toying with us, it would be 49 and 69 to get more notes. And the reality was that they weren't, that you push a monosynth quite hard. It's like mixing. If you've got just a single line, you can push that quite hard, and you can put that into a fuzz unit, and it can sound great. As soon as you're playing chords, you're like, that's awful. It's just this distorted mess. And that's what happens inside a polysynth. You actually have to pull the levels back, which is why a polysynth always sounds a lot more polite than a monosynth, because a monosynth can go hard and use, well, lots of saturation. It can be distorting, and we're like, yeah. But if we do the same thing inside a polysynth, it sounds awful. Truly awful. Do that. Get a monosynth, or even just any synth, put it into monophonic, put it through a distortion or a fuzz line, and you're going, yeah, it's so cool. Put it back into poly. So I haven't changed anything on the levels here, and this sounds quite nice. But the problem is, it doesn't sound like a real polysynth. It doesn't sound like an Oberheim 4 voice in the real world. To be fair, the only moves that I've got here is that I messed with the tuning. Little extreme. With a real 4 voice that was programmed by hand, you would have changes on every single thing. Your filter would be a different place, your envelopes would be a different speed, which is part of why they sound so huge and endearing. But you've also got the problem of having to make your patch monophonically, which doesn't behave the same as polyphonically, and then to copy and paste your patch and have it actually work out. It's a total pain in the, and it just doesn't work out. It sounds nice, but if you're thinking, oh, I'll just spend the $50 rather than the couple of $100 for the 8 voice, no, it won't work. Go buy the 8 voice. And that explains why, if you've ever wondered why do polysynths not sound as raw as a monosynth, is because they can't. Because by the time you start summing those 4/8 voices through the output, the level of distortion that you're delighted with in a mono will just deliver you brutally disgusting sound out of your polysynth that you're trying to have sound nice, especially if you want your strings to sound pleasing. So the mono synth on its own is a special beast that you can't duplicate any other way than to have a mono synth that's designed from the ground up to be a mono synth that's going to do mono synth things and have all the limits of a mono synth. Bearing in mind the limits of the SEM architecture and then the way they've expanded on those with the extra doohickeys, the oscillator / LFO, the effects and the arpeggiator, I think they've done a great job. It doesn't make this instrument feel like it's losing its analogy kind of edge. I think they add to it, especially those effects. They really add a very cool something. Again, my advice is, other than the arpeggiator, don't lock things to sync. If you lock things to BPM or tempo sync, you're undoing the analog thing. The analog thing is because stuff moves around. If you want to do a cover of Kids in America, then my advice is don't use the arpeggiator. Use your LFO on a this, and then use that to open and close the filter, and then set your timing by hand, and boom, 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 becomes, you've got to set your DAW to that, and if it moves and changes a little bit, your DAW has to follow it, your band has to follow it, because that's how you get Kids in America. The reason I raise that is because somebody was talking about it, trying to emulate a sound. I don't think he was ever clear with us what sound he was trying to emulate, because whatever we said, he said no. The thing was, I then went and had a listen to the record off vinyl. So, it would be a real pressing off vinyl. And boy, was that song loose. In modern terms, listening to it going, oh, geez, that's a bit ragged. But its raggedness is part of its amazing sort of, not technically punk, but of its punk-like energy. So mono synths that you want to have sound analog, you've got to be a little wild with them. So my final words in conclusion is that if this is the kind of thing that you're looking for, I think they've done a beaut job. Don't ask me to compare it to every other simulation out there. They are all interesting. I've played with quite a few of them, and there are things I love about them, and I'm also broadly speaking about 2600s and all kinds of other monophonic synth emulations, like Cherry have got a few, and there are some really charming things about them, but you know what? They don't float my boat. But this one, it does have that amazing kind of thing. I mean, if we just look at that very first sound, obviously this is meant to be, and it is. I would really struggle to emulate that. I know what's happening. Sure, they've put this on the front to be, look how impressive we are. But, you know what? This is really impressive. So if that's vital for what you do, and that you absolutely can't get it any other way, I think it's 50 or whatever it is dollars very well spent. If you're going to want it to multiply and play more than one voice, then you've either got to do the Wendy Carlos and play that line many times, which will mean play your line monophonically, create a new track, load a new instance of this, and don't use the same patch like a lazy person. You're going to want to modify that patch because the second take may not have been done on the same day and the synth probably would have wandered out of tune. And then you play the second part of the chord. So you'd be, if you were going to play a C, you'd play that. Whole new track, possibly even a modified patch. Then you'd play, and then you do it again. That's how you get your C major. It's time consuming. It's the complete opposite of how things get done these days. but that's the closest you're going to get to a real sort of a switched on Bach or a real early performance of that kind of thing. And the sound is pretty darned impressive. Does it sound like a real analog? It sounds like a pretty good impression of a real analog. I can acknowledge that for sure. I think the actual audio quality is a little too high. I think there's too much on the top end. A lot of these things topped out or 6 or 8K. I don't know what the SEM was like, but I know a lot of early analog synths didn't have a particularly high fidelity to them. So I think this is probably higher fidelity than a real analog would be, not to mention all the noise and problems you'd have with one now. But for what it is, if it suits what you're looking for, it's a pretty joyous little box of cool. I hope you have found this interesting. I try to make sure that these are not just about the product, but are something that might teach you something about the whole music game as well and how these things work. If you have any questions, particularly about the broader context, because obviously if it's a GeForce thing, you need to go ask them. I don't get paid to troubleshoot for them, but if it's a broader question, ask them down below, preferably after hitting the subscribify yourself button. That helps YouTube to know that we are valued by you. Plays count for something, but engagement counts for an awful lot. So if you want us to help you to be here, then subscribing and talking to us helps far more than just plays. Of course, there is also higherhertz.com, and you can scoot on over there and dig in and find Hertz delay. There might be something else there too, which if you are looking to work in the I want to sound or feel more loosey-goosey, analogy, old-schooly, Hertz delay is going to be a lot of fun for you. It's a very unusual approach to munging echoes, choruses, saturation, and reverb all into one slightly unusual workflow. Otherwise, go out there, have fun, have a great day.